Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good Monday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with you on this 4th of April now. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information for your community and village, or if you're traveling to other parts of Alaska or beyond. You can do that very easily by going to weather.gov, and if you add /Alaska at the end of that, you'll get your local weather information for our state. Of course, if you're traveling outside of Alaska, weather.gov will provide you the map where you can simply click on the place you're going, whether that's Seattle or Portland or further south or east, and you can get your local weather information so you can be better prepared for your travels there. The weather info line is always open at 800-472-0391. Find us on Facebook. We've been talking about several things in the last week, whether that's heat or the aurora or rainfall. All these things are always just good topics of conversation. Everybody likes to talk about the weather, and we're trying to do something about it, of course. NWS Alaska on Twitter is a good place to go. Of course, you can localize that even more. If you like to say NWS Anchorage, you'll get South Central and Southwest information. NWS Fairbanks is a good place to go for the interior and North Slope information. If you use the hashtag AKwx, that gives you the conversation from places that may not follow the Weather Service accounts there. NWS Juneau also clues you into what's going on in Southeast. And find us on YouTube anytime. AKwx is a good place to start. If you use AKwx TV, you'll get this entire broadcast after we're done posting it later on in the evening hours. So be sure and check that out in case you missed something. You just come back into home a little bit late and you want to catch up on your Alaska weather. It's an easy way to do it. Here's a look at the hazardous weather information now for tonight. Winter weather advisories continue for the North Slope communities as well as the north and eastern north slopes of the Brooks Range there. Winter weather advisories are usually issued for snow or maybe slick road conditions or maybe a little bit of wind, or all of those things kind of piled on but not in really excessive amounts. So in this case, it's wind blowing and drifting some snow around. Because of that, the gusty winds could pick up and blow the snow around and create some poor visibility from time to time. So if you're anywhere from Point Hope all the way out toward Kaktovik, Barrow to Wainwright or Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse, north of the summits from Arctic Village and along the Dalton Highway, you could probably run into some spots where the visibility may not be that great thanks to those gusty winds. With easterlies in place, again, we're blowing in some of that colder and drier air, not expecting a whole lot more of additional snowfall in these areas, but the visibility could be poor enough that you might lose your way for a brief moment or so. So make sure that you have a plan. Make sure you know that who's moving around, and if you're the one moving around, make sure someone else knows where you're going and when you're expected to be there, and keep you and your family safe. So winter weather advisories continue at least for a little while longer for the North Slope, and in some cases until about 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. Out around the Pribilofs, the winter weather advisory is posted for you as well. You've had some accumulating snow around the St. Paul area. And because of that and the winds in place, again, a winter weather advisory for the same exact reasons we see it on the North Slope has been issued for you. That'll go through the evening hours. So plan for that. Winter weather advisories in the Pribilofs. A new breakup map's been issued for this 4th of April there from the Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center. Unfortunately, we don't see any new changes there. Right now, all the main stem rivers across the 49th state are listed as mostly ice. You can find this anytime online if you'd like to check up. At any time they give us an update, we will pass that on to you. But we like to know about your updates, and so will the forecasters there as we head into breakup. For the Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center, they absolutely depend on your information and your reports and your pictures. Ann Millard is one of our favorite go-to people up in Eagle for giving us river pictures there, and you can do exactly what she does. She sends us a quick email and sends it to the forecasters there at the Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center. Find the email on the webpage there and just take a picture of your river. If you see some changes, you are the expert in your village and in your community about what is normal. And when things start to change or move or shift or melt, let us know, because that information helps the people downstream. And we all live downstream in Alaska, don't we? So make sure you're doing your part in helping all of us do a better job in keeping all of our communities safe as we head through breakup. Of course, expecting things to start changing here in the next couple of weeks. So this is the latest map, and not a whole lot changed since the end of March. On to what's going on right now. Satellite picture in infrared mode telling us that a plume of moisture is moving across the central and eastern Gulf of Alaska. The main moisture with this is moving to the north and east, and you can see it's going to be generally south of Sitka, but some of this is going to wrap back into the panhandle there, so expect more and more rain as we get into the midweek here. As we go through Tuesday, in general, many areas up and down the panhandle probably looking at about an inch or so of precipitation, so it may be steady and light throughout that entire period, but it will probably be persistent at that point as well. Now across Prince William Sound and the eastern side of the Kenai Peninsula, clouds aplenty there. Moisture is mainly locked up across the coastal areas of South Central, and once that gets over the Kenai Mountains, not seeing a whole lot of precipitation across the Cook Inlet region. So Kenai, Soldotna, up the road toward Anchorage and even into the Susitna Valley. Not a whole lot going on there. Maybe a sprinkle from time to time, but a much better chance you're going to see that over the mountains than anywhere else. And then once you get over the Alaska Range, look at what happens here. Very dry conditions there for the upper Kuskokwim and the lower and the middle Yukon Valley. Things really drying up there. And the moisture that has persisted to cross over some of the higher terrain in the Aleutian Range has made it into Bristol Bay and across the eastern Bering Sea coast, all the way up the YK Delta into Norton Sound and around the Bering Strait and St. Lawrence Island, and kind of snaking its way up into the Chukchi Seacoast. As we look out to the west, you'll notice most of the moisture is kind of drying up as it moves from north to south there. That's that colder flow making its way down on the backside of this overall low pressure system that's hovering over Alaska right now. You can see a little bit of a different flow trying to work its way in across the western chain. As that works in from the south and the west, we get a hint of a new weather system starting to develop out across the North Pacific, and that warmer air will be lifting toward the central and western Aleutians as we go ahead in time. You'll see that on the surface chart here in just a few minutes. Today's weather map shows low pressure south of Sandpoint at 978 millibars. We've got that warm and wet flow across the eastern Gulf. Warmer air is lifting towards southeast. Already a little bit of light rain out ahead of that. More clouds than anything else across south central, as I said, and there's our snow and blowing snow for parts of the Pribilofs, and more blowing snow than anything else falling from the sky across the North Slope and some of the north and eastern Brooks Range communities. Most of what we're seeing across the interior today is just dry sky, cool and breezy conditions at times, but nothing really clouding up too much for most places from the middle Tanana Valley or westward. However, Fairbanks did pick up a little bit of snow over the weekend. Out across the region tonight, we expect low pressure to really start to focus on southeastern Alaska. The pressure gradient's going to tighten up a little bit more south of Haida Gwaii and west of the Dixon Entrance and south of Sitka. That's going to keep the winds moving in a little bit, and you're going to notice those winds switching around a little bit more for our southern communities when we get into our marine maps here for southeast in a bit. Notice that the pressure gradient's not quite as tight across northern and central parts of southeast, but the rain certainly is present all the way from southeast to Prince William Sound to Kodiak Island and all the way through the Alaska Peninsula, with low pressure just south of Sandpoint around 985 millibars. It's not a terribly strong system, but it's enough to draw the air through our favorite gaps in the central and eastern chain, and it should be cold enough there that we could expect some light snow or maybe a rain-snow mix around areas east of Atka and all the way to the west of Akilski. Now out across the Chukchi Seacoast, watch for periods of light snow there. Not really anything significant, but the blowing snow may be more of an issue. The pressure gradient will loosen up a little bit as you get into the lower and middle Yukon Valley. Snow showers still possible north of Fairbanks and North Pole, it looks like. As we get into tonight, you'll see a wave of low pressure kind of set up across the Alaska Range a little bit, and that's going to loosen up what's going on across the eastern Gulf. Low pressure will fill in a little bit more south of Sandpoint and Kodiak Island, sloshing light amounts of rainfall across southeast, south central, and the Kenai Peninsula, but again, not a whole lot really working its way into the Cook Inlet region. So right now, Anchorage is looking fairly dry considering what else is going on around the coastal communities. Up across the lower and middle Yukon Valley, as well as the upper Kuskokwim, more clouds than anything else, and in some cases very few clouds, it looks like. Dry air across the north slope there, with rain and snow showers a little bit more likely out across the central and western chain. A 975 millibar low working in from the north and the west, or from the south and west, I should say, and then running into more stable and dry air across the western Bering Sea. Now, for the ice that has been working its way southward, we'll probably continue to see that progression of ice, but it's breaking off chunks and sending those southward into warmer regions of air. So a lot of that isn't making it a whole lot further southward, but as you look at the ice edge here in a little bit, you'll probably notice that has shifted southward just a little bit more than we were talking about over the weekend. West of the Pribilofs, a 979 millibar low on Wednesday, pushing rain and snow showers toward the Pribilofs, and with that we remove the overall risk of just snow and kind of start to mix that in with rain and snow as we get into the midweek. Out across Bristol Bay, south central, and again most of that around the coastal areas. We're looking at light rainfall there. Not a whole lot again around the Cook Inlet region. North of that into the Talkeetna is a chance for some snow showers into the Copper River Basin. Dry conditions up north, but we still have that wind that's really going to focus across coastal areas for Wednesday. Once you get into the interior and the higher terrain, things should clear up and the wind should lessen somewhat. For southeast, another surge of warmer and wetter air moving northward will keep the rain focus on the Panhandle as we go into Wednesday afternoon. This low pressure system will continue to track kind of north and east as we get into the end of the week. Here's a look at current temperatures now. Most areas in southeast saw highs in the mid to upper 40s today, lower 50s around Hyder and just south of Haida Gwaii. 51 in Cordova, 46 in Valdez. It was 44 in Kenai today, just a hair cooler in Anchorage, 37 around Squetna, lower 40s for Fairbanks, 42 in Eagle, and 48 for Northway, with 19 in Fort Yukon, 18 for Anaktuvuk Pass, and single-digit temps for most of the Arctic coast. It was 2 in Barrow, 4 in Atkasuk, 5 in Kaktovik, 4 for Wainwright, and Kotzebue Sound temperatures were considerably warmer there. You'll notice many areas reporting highs today in the lower to mid-30s. It was 6 around Wales, 36 in Nome, and 45 in Unalakleet, with 41 in Galena. 42 today was the temperature in McGrath, with temps around Bethel and out toward the outer coast in the 30s and 40s. Gamble Island, or St. Lawrence Island, 7 degrees. Gamble on St. Lawrence Island was only 7. The Pribilofs showing 29 to 32 degrees there from St. Paul to St. George, and Kodiak Island in the lower to mid 40s. And low to mid 40s for the Alaska Peninsula, and 39 around Unalaska and Dutch Harbor, with Adak and Atka in the lower 30s. Shemya showed 31. Now, overnight low temperatures will stay above freezing in many locations in south central. Kodiak Island 39. Southeast expect lows in the mid 40s, with the middle Tanana Valley in the upper 20s. 7 for Fort Yukon and the upper Yukon Valley. 5 to 10 below for the Arctic coast. Kotzebue Sound in the lower teens. Norton Sound in the mid 20s. The YK Delta in the upper 20s to low 30s. Bristol Bay in the mid 30s, with the Pribilofs holding close to freezing. And most of the Alaska Peninsula in the upper 30s to about 40, with the central and western chain in the lower 30s. Highs there tomorrow in the upper 30s to about 40. The Bristol Bay temps closing in on 50 degrees in some cases. Kodiak Island in the mid 40s, near 50 for south central. For southeast, upper 40 should do the trick, including the capital city around 45. The middle Tanana Valley may be a little milder tomorrow. Highs in the mid 40s there. Teens and 20s for areas north of the Yukon Valley. The Brooks Range temperatures in the teens and 20s as well. And the North Slope and Coastal Plain generally in the single digits, with Barrow again closer to 5. Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse about 1, with Shishmaref in the lower 20s, Nome near 30, and the YK Delta again in the 30s and 40s. IFR conditions will be expected to start the day around Prince William Sound, and for southern outer coastal areas for southeast, along the North Slope through the western sections of St. Lawrence Island to west of the Pribilofs and into Dutch Harbor and Unalaska. Watch what happens as we get into the afternoon, though. A lot of this shifts a little bit further off to the west. Most of the interior and most of your passes should be VFR. We'll see MVFR conditions hit and miss throughout southeast. Prince William Sound and the Cook Inlet region right now looking to be VFR, but the eastern Aleutians may be dealing with IFR conditions through a good part of the day. Here's your pass conditions then. Anaktuvuk and Anigan Pass we expect to be VFR. Look for most of the Alaska Range to be VFR through some part of the day. MVFR may develop for Lake Clark and Merrill Pass as we go, but Rainy Pass, Windy Pass, and as we head out toward Isabel Pass, all expecting that to be VFR. MVFR conditions developing in Mentasta Pass. Tanita Pass probably VFR through most of the day. Portage Pass, MVFR through the afternoon, especially on the eastern side, and Chilkoot and White Pass may lean over toward MVFR as we get into the day. Here's a look at your freezing levels now. You can see that warm and wet air is lifting northward once again and spreading over southwestern Alaska with levels as high as 2,000 feet around Nunivak Island and southward, 4,000 to 8,000 feet as you head into southeastern Alaska. Icing potential right now seems to be isolated moderate at best, above 4,000 to 5,000 feet around the Alaska Range and west of the YK Delta, and across south central and southwestern Alaska, especially over Kodiak Island, below 4,000 feet for the Kodiak Island region, and above 2,000 feet as you head out across the central and western chain. The jet stream potential shows that low pressure is sitting across the central and western chain. Wind speeds really the greatest south of Alaska as they have been all season. You can see that dip in the jet stream out across the North Pacific, 110 to 160 knots, rounding high pressure across the western coast. This right here is keeping most of our weather fairly stable right now for most of the state. At 9,000 feet, our southwesterly flows focusing that wet weather on southeast. Wind speeds slow down over the interior, about 15 to 20 knots, and northeasterly winds brought to us by high pressure across the Beaufort Seacoast. Look for winds to remain fairly light at this level across the central and western parts of the Aleutians. At 3,000 feet, wind speeds pick up, though, as that low pressure system works in from the west. You'll look for winds around 50 knots there. Winds coming in from the south and west over the Panhandle at 10 to 30 knots, and then once again slowing down across the interior over the middle Yukon Valley, about 15 knots from the south and east, and picking up a little bit more as they head out over Kotzebue Sound, 15 to 20. Turbulence will focus on southeast, then generally below 4,000 feet, watching for occasional moderate there. Some light chop across the north slope below 4,000 feet and also across the central and western chain tomorrow. That's a look at your aviation forecast. I'll be back in just a few minutes with the rest of your marine weather. Stay tuned.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Harry Keeling, and on behalf of the Alaskan Aviation Safety Foundation and Alaska Public Media, welcome to Hangar Flying. Our guest this evening is Steve Perot. Steve is rather unique in that he is both an experienced manned aircraft and unmanned aircraft pilot. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about his manned aircraft background. His parents learned to fly in Fairbanks back in 1955. Flying is in the family. His son flies for Hagelin. Steve himself soloed in a glider at 14 and has owned a 150, 172, Beech 19, and now a really nice Cherokee 235. He has a commercial ticket and regularly flies IFR. Welcome, Steve.
Hi, Harry.
But before we leave that introduction, I want us to talk about the unmanned side. I consider you a pioneer, tracing back to 2006 and some of your early efforts at Pipeline Patrol. But I'm going to let you describe that journey. The unmanned aircraft industry, Steve's come a long way in the last couple of years, but when you first got involved with it, wasn't quite so smooth. Go back to 2006 and describe what you were doing or trying to do.
Okay, at the time, the big project we worked on for 06 and a lot of 07 was with the goal of continuously monitoring 40,000 miles of pipeline in the lower 48, and that was a bit of a challenge. And surprisingly, the challenge wasn't so much the platforms. There were plenty of good unmanned vehicles out there at the time, the Scan Eagle and Shadow and some of those, bigger and larger. The problems were more in the sensors, the comms, the software, and to some extent in the logistics. And the sensors, by that I mean the cameras and, you know, infrared sensors and that. The comms, the big problem is if you do recognize an anomaly, how do you get that back to a dispatcher if you're flying low, you know, 100 miles out in the middle of nowhere? And then the logistics issue is more about just typical logistics. How do you get the aircraft in, refuel it, get it ready to go again? But the big problem was really the anomaly detection. If you've got an aircraft up there of any kind flying, well, if you got a guy looking out the window looking for problems, that's easy. But if you've got software trying to determine whether something that's seen is actually a problem or not, that's a pretty hard thing to do. So there's that, and then of course at some point the FAA originally didn't have a stance on unmanned aircraft when we started the project, but then they came up with a stance which is absolutely never will there ever be an unmanned aircraft in our airspace at that time. So that's when we shut down the project.
And that's what I'd like to transition to. I mean, it wasn't too many years, 2 or 3 years ago, where all we heard was can't commercially fly, or you got to. I mean, there were so many restrictions that it certainly dissuaded some of the people that are operating today. Would you talk a little bit about? Let's fast forward to say 2012, 2013, when things opened up.
Okay, so we had heard that this same group of people basically had heard that the FAA was getting more open to operations. They'd been mandated by Congress to do that in the 2012 Reauthorization Act. And so we developed an RFP for a number of operations up on the slope, including mapping of roads, pipelines, gravel
And RFP
pits.
is what?
Oh, I'm sorry, a request for proposals. And we put that out not just to unmanned operators, but to everybody who thought they could do any of the tasks we put out there. And long story short, AeroVironment won. And that set us on quite a long journey with the FAA. They needed to get their Puma aircraft, which you might be familiar with. It's a 9-foot wingspan, battery powered. They actually had to get a restricted category type certificate to fly that. So again, that's a long, expensive journey. Since then, there's Section 333 exemptions, which are much easier for a small operator to get going. So now I think there's about 3,000 commercial operators in the U.S. and 8 or 9 here in Alaska, as a matter of fact.
So Steve, we've had a number of guests on the program to talk about unmanned aircraft. A couple of 333 holders talk about some of the efforts in Alaska. And I appreciate you being on because you provide, like I said at your introduction, the perspective of a manned aircraft pilot and an unmanned aircraft pilot. What I'd like to do is, we're running out of time, but I want to get you on next time, and specifically I want to talk about a project that you and the Safety Foundation worked on to add, really to, instead of standing on the sidelines watching this integration of unmanned aircraft, trying to incorporate some of the lessons that we learned in manned aircraft into unmanned aircraft. So if I can get you back on the program, we'll talk about that next time.
Great.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed tonight's program. Remember that we are member supported, and also I would encourage you to go to our website and provide feedback on our programs. It really helps us in designing future programs. And next program we'll have Steve back on, but until then, fly safe.
Thanks, Harry. We'll see you again on Friday. Here's a look at the sea ice edge, and as we were talking about, that slow drift to the south and west continues there with northeasterly and persistent winds. That's breaking off pieces of the main ice there and shoving that southward, but it's also running into the warmer air across the Kuskokwim Bay. So we're not seeing a whole lot of that advancing right now. You can see some more openings in the water and leads there up around Point Hope to Kivalina and around Point Lay and northward. And watch for some changes there south of St. Matthew. For the very latest sea ice edge analysis, thickness, and sea surface temperatures and more, go to weather.gov/anchorage/ice.php. On to southeast now, a steady and southeasterly wind moving across the inner channels there at 20 to 35 knots. The higher seas there in the Clarence Strait at 7 feet, 2 to 4 foot seas in the Lynn Canal, and 20 to 25 knot winds across the outer coast with more of a southwesterly push south of Sitka as that warmer and wetter air works its way northward. By Wednesday, a little bit more of a south and easterly turn across the outer coast, still holding around 20 to 25 with the inner channels running at 15 to 25. The higher seas in Clarence Strait still, and 3 foot seas northward up through Stevens Passage and into the Lynn Canal. Look for seas on the outer coast to range from 10 to 11 feet. For south central northeasterlies coming down Cook Inlet at 15 to 25, but more of a stronger easterly flow west of the Barrens at 30 knots with a northeast wind inside of Shelikof Strait. Winds will become east and southeasterly across the north and western Gulf, anywhere from 10 to 25 knots. The southeasterly flow strengthens and becomes a due east as inside of Prince William Sound and closer to the coast along the Copper River Delta there. So watch for that. Seas could be as high as 8 feet there. A little bit more of a southeasterly push as we get into Wednesday. Winds diminish inside of Prince William Sound. Northeasterlies coming down Cook Inlet at 15 to 20 knots, and easterlies remain west of the Barrens at 20 knots with an 8-foot sea. Winds diminish in the Shelikof Strait with southerlies on the eastern side of Kodiak Island, 20 knots there with a 10-foot sea. Across the Alaska Peninsula and inside Bristol Bay, look for an easterly flow there at 20 knots with a 3-foot sea. North and westerly winds crossing the southern part of the peninsula, 15 to 20 with 10-foot seas on the Pacific coast, 11-foot seas from Castle Cape to Chignik. On Wednesday, a little bit of a change there in the region with 10 knots with 9-foot seas. Otherwise, southerlies coming into the southern part of the Pacific coast along the peninsula, and a light easterly flow inside of Bristol Bay with a 2-foot sea on Wednesday. For the Aleutians, northwesterlies continue east of Atka to Unalaska, 30 knots in all areas there, 12-foot seas in the Bering Sea coast and 9 to 12-foot seas in the Pacific coast. A southeasterly wind develops from Adak to Shemya. 10 to 14-foot seas are expected there on a 35-knot wind. For Wednesday, the winds reverse course and blow in from the west at a stronger note. 40 knots expected from Atka to Adak and west to Kiska and Attu. 24 to 26-foot seas are expected there, with westerlies continuing into the central and eastern chain. 9 to as high as 14-foot seas on the Pacific coast, and 5 to as high as 18-foot seas there along the Bering Sea coast for the midweek. For the west coast, light northwesterlies crossing St. Lawrence Island and Gamble, northerlies around St. Matthew, and northeasterlies in the Kuskokwim Delta region, 20 knots with a 4-foot sea, 8-foot seas over the Pribilofs on Tuesday. For Wednesday, winds diminish around St. Lawrence Island. Southeasterlies, though, are expected for the Kuskokwim Delta at 20 knots with 2-foot seas, and southeasterlies for the Pribilofs with 15 knots and a 3-foot sea there as we get into Wednesday. Northeasterlies will continue for St. Matthew and around Nunivak Island, 15 to 25 over the ice. Now for the North Slope, look for easterlies to pick up a little bit more around Kaktovik. Again, with blowing snow, winter weather advisories may continue as well. Northeasterlies will diminish a little bit around Cape Lisburn to Point Hope, and look for light easterly winds outside of Kotzebue Sound only at 5 knots. That is a one-day sail, with southeasterlies picking up a little bit more on Wednesday there, and the easterlies remain across the North Slope and Beaufort Seacoast and Chukchi Seacoast for that matter, anywhere from 25 to 35 knots for Wednesday. Recapping tonight's weather, winter weather advisories continue for the northern coast, for the Beaufort and Chukchi Seacoast, and also for the northeastern slopes of the Brooks Range for poor visibility but not a whole lot of additional snowfall. A winter weather advisory with light snowfall and gusty winds continues for the Pribilofs through tonight, with low pressure focusing more rain in southeast and across coastal areas of south central, Kodiak Island, and the Bristol Bay region. Wednesday, some of that will dry up in the west, with rain continuing for southeast, and a new weather maker moves in across the southern Bering Sea for Wednesday.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.